Years ago, in the early days of this channel, I used to do lots of Commodore 64 videos. I'm the kind of guy who suddenly realizes that I should try YouTubing and just turn the camera on 5 minutes later without having the faintest idea of how to make videos. Needless to say, those videos were pretty horrible and have been removed from the channel. Hopefully my videos have improved since then, but now this channel needs some new Commodore 64 videos. To test any Commodore 64, we need a working display, so that should be a good start. I think this Commodore is working, at least it was when I checked last time. And it actually took me a good 15 minutes to find a working Commodore when I needed one. So I'm way behind with my Commodore 64 projects. Okay, so let's connect the power to that display. Okay, nothing went bang. That's always a good sign. Let's turn the power on and hit the power switch on the display. Okay, it's making a very nasty coil noise. Hopefully it's not killing your ears. And the LED on the front panel doesn't light up. So yeah, that is a dead display for sure. I'll give you a sample of that nasty coil noise. Well, let's see if we can fix it. And the usual disclaimer, of course. Please don't mess around inside CRT displays. They may be charged with high voltages, even with the cord unplugged. I grew up with a Commodore 64 back in the 80s. I also had an Apple II for a year, and a Commodore VIC. But the Commodore 64 is definitely the machine of my childhood. My favorite game was Bruce Lee. And I also spent a lot of time programming BASIC. I think we also need to remove this screw up here. Okay, now I think we can pull that lid off. Okay, in here we have a bunch of soot and dust. So this display has seen some normal use. This is the S model, so it has 2 speakers in the lid. The speakers have been disconnected. There's also someone else's fingerprints in here. So someone has been inside this display. But this display was actually working when I bought it. So presumably it has been repaired at least once. Well, I don't see anything obviously wrong. So nothing has popped or exploded. Unfortunately. This is, by the way, a 1084 SP. So this one here is made by Philips. There were at least 2 different manufacturers of these. And I think in many different variations. So I'm going to switch the power on again and see if I can identify which coil is making that noise. Well, that's really hard to tell, but I'm going to try and use my microphone and move it around in different spots. And maybe I can see on the volume scale where the noise is coming from. Okay, I had to replace the audio here, because that high-pitched noise was just unbearable. But what I was saying here was that I got 1 bar on the volume pretty much everywhere on the display, except for this one spot here. So this is probably where we have the issue on this board right here. Okay, so cap seems to be discharged on this board. Let's take this thing apart. As with so many displays, some of the wires on the neck board have connectors, but some of them are soldered to the PCB. So the neck board has to come off together with the main PCB. That means we need to remove it. The cable to the yoke, however, has a connector connected to the main PCB. We also need to cut a few zip ties to free the main PCB from the tube. And then I need to remember to reinstall new zip ties. On most displays, the PCB is held down with a couple of screws here, but not in this case. The PCB is now free. However, it's connected to the power supply. And the power supply is still stuck. But I think we have a tab here that may release it. Yep. That was most certainly the case. Let's see if we can partially remove it so we can access the remaining connectors. So we've got 1 ground cable on the neck board and 1 on the main PCB. And then some cable management tucked in far inside the display. And one more connector on the power supply. Okay, that freed up the power supply. And now we can access this connector here. I think that was the last one. Yep, here comes the PCB. Well, with the power supply out, I still can't see anything weird. So let's disconnect it. Remove the screw here. And pull that PCB off the plastic brackets. And now we can inspect the solder joints at the back. No, all solder joints look fine on this board. Well, the two most common faults with 1084 displays is a bad power switch and a horizontal output transistor. But the noise is clearly coming from this PCB, so I'm not sure what to think right now. I'll wash all the parts and do some thinking. I'm going to dry clean the tube, and then I'm going to wash the rest in warm soapy water and leave it to dry. And here comes the tube, and as expected, being a 1084p, it has a Phillips tube. Okay, said and done. Everything has been washed and is now nice and clean and much nicer to work on. So the next step is to do a partial reassembly. I did a visual inspection of the board, but I can't see anything obviously wrong. Nothing is blown, leaking, and I couldn't find any cracked solder joints. Those are common faults with CRT displays, and totally worth checking. This could be caused by something shorted on the main PCB, but since the noise is coming from the power supply, I think we should test this display with the borrowed power supply. That way we will know if the issue is with the main PCB or the power supply. Okay, let's turn the power on and hit that power switch. No, still the same fault. So it's not the power supply. I think we have a short on the main PCB. Well, since this transistor here is the most common fault, I think it's wise to start by testing it. So this guy here is marked TS467. If it's shorted, that would totally explain why the power supply shuts down. This guy is so big, it doesn't really fit my cheap and cheerful component tester. But let's try anyways. Oh, it actually does work. It's a BJT NPN, according to the tester. So that is probably a working transistor. This transistor actually didn't have any heat paste on it. So I'm going to apply some before I reinstall it. Sorry for accusing you of being bad, little transistor. Well, it's actually quite large. Well, the other main suspect is the flyback. So that's the next thing to try on the list. The soldering stuff on this board is actually quite easy. So no thick ground planes on this PCB. That's nice for a change. The flyback also has two wires connecting it to the neck board. So we need to pop this lid off. And inside the lid here, this wire is soldered to this tab. So it needs to be desoldered. The other wire is also held down with a zip tie. And soldered to the PCB, of course. So let's try this board with another flyback. This is a used flyback, but it's working. So it's good enough for this display. I think these original flybacks are out of production. But I think there are replacements available. Although this is the most common fault with these displays, I'm kind of hoping it's something else. Something cheap and easy to fix. Well, there's only one way to find out. Well, actually, there are other ways to find out. But this is the quick and lazy method. If you have some spare parts. Okay, board reinstalled with the tested flyback. Let's turn the power on and turn the display on. Oh, we've got high voltage. So unfortunately, I think it's the flyback. Let's connect the Commodore and turn it on again. Yeah, it's totally working. So there we have it. Bad flyback. That's too bad. But the good news is that the display is working and the image is excellent. Even with brightness and contrast set to 50%. So that tube has many more hours left in it. And by the way, the door isn't broken on this one. So that's a bit rare. Well, my Aldi replica here seems to be working just fine. So I'll go and grab something that isn't. How about my orange C64C? I bought this machine many years ago and it was completely covered in ink. So someone had used a Sharpie and sort of painted the entire lid. I managed to get most of it off with IPA, but the case still has some greyish spots, so it didn't look nice. So there was no way to save that case. Well, aside from respraying it in orange, like I did. However, when I grabbed it a couple of years ago, it turned out to be broken. So let's see if we can fix it. The sticker underneath says garbled screen and black screen. So let's turn the power switch on and see which one it is. Well, the power LED lit up. No, we're getting nothing. No, that Commodore is definitely black screen. So let's have a peek inside. I tend to leave the screws out on my Commodores because I mess around inside quite frequently. Okay, let's see what we've got in here. Well, screws are out on the keyboard too, apparently. Well, I usually leave the screws inside the case, but not in this case, no pun intended. Okay, we've got a 250466 and a 6581R4 AR. So we've got a nice SID chip in this machine. Well, I can see one possible issue right away, but I'm not sure it could cause a black screen. The CIA chip here is in a machine socket. And as you may know, I've had some issues with machine sockets. So the first thing I want to test is to just push firmly on that CIA chip and turn the machine on. Yeah, now it works. Damn those machine sockets. They have caused me so much trouble. Now we're getting some random characters on the screen. Yeah, I'm not having much luck with machine sockets. I used to use them for everything. Then I ran into a similar issue about 3 years ago. And I stopped using them completely. And since then, I haven't had any issues with sockets. It only makes sense to replace this one too. The 250466 board is the predecessor to the short board. So it only has 2 RAM chips and a rather unusual MOS 6581R4AR. Unfortunately, one of the ROMs is in a machine socket too. Well, I don't think you want to watch me desolder 40-pin sockets, so I'll skip ahead here. Some of the pins are a bit stubborn. So I'll add some fresh solder and have a second go with the desoldering gun. I just noticed, apparently I didn't have a 40-pin socket when I repaired this board. So this is actually 2 different sockets, cut to size. They are still stuck to the board. So I'm gonna use the Rework station and melt that solder before I push the socket out. Well, I skipped ahead here, but that is an extremely stubborn socket. So let's try from this side. This is gonna get messy. The socket is going to melt, of course. But that doesn't matter, we're going to throw it away anyways. Okay, so here's our first molten socket. I'm not using any force whatsoever, by the way. I'm just very gently pulling on that socket. And I let the heat do the job. And instead, I'm going to install dual wipe sockets. All the through holes cleared out nicely. So here's the issue I'm having. A brand new chip has quite long legs, but reused chips desoldered from the board have much shorter legs. Machine sockets only have very small holes, whereas dual wipe sockets have much wider holes. So when you use a brand new chip, it works quite well in a machine socket, because it goes quite far down into the socket. However, with a reused chip, only a fraction of that pin will make contact with the socket. But since the dual wipe socket has much wider holes, the chip goes much further down into the socket and also makes contact to the wide area of the pin. So that's what's causing me all that trouble. Some of the through holes still have some solder left in them, so I'll add some fresh solder and use the desoldering gun to get that solder out. And we can now install brand new 24 pin socket, and as always I solder two of the pins roughly in the middle of the socket first, and then I make sure that the socket sits flush before I solder the remaining pins. So let's reinstall those chips in the brand new sockets and reconnect the keyboard and the power LED. Now let's see if it works. Yep, no surprises here. So just machine sockets. That's all it was. Well, the orange Commodore seems to work just fine now. But this joystick kind of sucks. It doesn't respond too well when I push up and right. Let's see if we can fix it too. So these are Suncom TAC-2. Probably the most popular choice for Commodore 64 users. But they're not the obvious choice for when I use the Commodore 64. I quite often go with the slick stick or my homemade gamepad. The slick stick is much smaller and gives you better control than the TAC-2. And then we have the homemade gamepad. I made it about 10 years ago. Nowadays I think you can buy these pre-made. So I just used a very cheap USB controller. The type that you will find on AliExpress for next to nothing. And then I used prototyping boards like this. Cut them to size and installed them inside the controller with soldered switches. So very simple project, but it has been working flawlessly for about 10 years now. And I used the cord from an original Commodore 64 joystick. The funny thing here is that my mod here actually improved this controller, because now it has proper switches inside instead of rubber dome buttons. And now back to the TAC-2, but they are not all identical. Some of them were made in the US and some of them were made in Taiwan. I don't know the whole story behind it, whether they moved the factory or if they were making both at the same time. Visually you can't really see the difference, but if you have a look underneath, oh, this is difficult to see on camera, but it clearly says made in USA on this one. And this one here says made in Taiwan. I don't know if there is any difference inside, but let's find out. Okay, so this one is made in US, and the screws are hidden underneath these rubber pads. So let me see if I can find another one. Here's another one made in the US with the rubber feet removed. So let's have a look inside this one. Okay, let's see what we will find inside here. 2 large push buttons with large springs. So this ball here is connected to this wire here, and it basically just makes contact with these pads here. That's all there is to it. This thing here is filled up with some nasty hair, so this is probably what's causing our issue. I'll clean this mess up and we'll compare it to the other joystick. The Taiwanese joystick is put together with different screws. So someone has probably been inside here. Yeah, definitely. This is not the correct screw. Someone has painted the top of it. So let's have a look inside. Well, there is one difference. The one made in the US has nickel-plated contacts, but the one made in Taiwan has bare copper. Both of these are filled up with some kind of grease, presumably conductive grease. One important thing to know about these joysticks is that they suffer from the same issue as the Commodore 64 bread bin case. If you leave them with a cord touching the plastics, the cord will make burn marks, so that is something to consider. Store them with a cord away from the joystick. Well, one Commodore fixed, but we have many more to repair and restore. If you're watching this sometime in the future, there will be a link on the screen shortly to the next repair. If you're watching this fresh, hit the bell icon below and set it to all. And now is a good time to watch this video. I will end by saying thank you to my patrons. I appreciate your support. If you want to support me too, consider becoming a patron. Patrons get ad-free early access. If you like this video, let me know with a thumbs up in the comments. If you're a regular viewer, consider subscribing to this channel. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next week.